Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. Zephyr perched herself behind a partially opaque partition in the starship's observation deck, her large, glowing emerald eyes focused intently on the human diplomat, Ethan Carter. He was oblivious to her presence, moving about his quarters just beyond the transparent walls. Kalari culture frowned upon such blatant curiosity, but Zephyr couldn't help herself. Humans were fascinating, so raw and unpolished compared to her species. Their emotional transparency, their inefficient physical forms, and yet, their astounding resilience intrigued her. She justified her behavior as research, but deep down, she knew it was something more personal. Ethan wasn't just any human, there was something about his easy demeanor and confident stride that drew her in. Her study became infinitely more interesting when Ethan began unbuttoning his uniform jacket. Zephyr froze, her heart thrumming in her chest, a sensation she wasn't accustomed to. Kalari biology didn't emphasize adrenaline responses in non-lethal situations, yet here she was, fully captivated as Ethan peeled off his jacket, revealing a snug, fitted undershirt beneath. The light from the cabin highlighted the sharp contours of his shoulders and arms, muscles flexing as he moved. She wasn't entirely sure why she couldn't look away. Perhaps it was the novelty of it. Humans didn't have the sleek, silver-blue complexion of the Kalari, nor their refined symmetry. They were rugged, imperfect, and captivating in their imperfection. Just as she leaned in slightly for a better view, Ethan suddenly turned, his eyes catching her reflection in the glass wall. Zephyr's heart skipped, a sensation utterly alien to her physiology. She bolted upright, attempting to retreat, but it was too late. Ethan strode to the partition, his brows furrowed in confusion and a hint of irritation. "Were you watching me?" he asked, his voice muffled through the partition but sharp enough to make her ears flick with embarrassment. Zephyr hesitated. Her Kalari pride screamed at her to deny it, to maintain her aloof dignity. But lying was against her people's code. "I was observing," she admitted, her voice even but laced with the tiniest tremor. "Purely for academic purposes." Ethan's expression shifted, his brow arching. "Academic purposes," he repeated, skepticism dripping from his words. He opened a nearby panel and toggled the door, stepping through to face her directly. "Is this a Kalari thing? Spying on people?" Zephyr stiffened. "Spying implies malicious intent. I assure you, I was merely curious." Ethan crossed his arms, his undershirt clinging to his frame. Zephyr found herself looking away, her gaze falling to the floor in an unusual display of contrition. "Well, in human culture," Ethan began, "it's called invading someone's privacy. It's kind of a big deal." Zephyr glanced up, her emerald eyes narrowing. "Humans are paradoxical. You share intimate details about your lives on your global network for anyone to see, yet you draw arbitrary lines when someone observes you in person." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected retort. "That's different," he countered. "Social media's a choice. Peeking in on someone when they don't know it? That's creepy." "Creepy?" Zephyr echoed, unfamiliar with the term. "Your language is unnecessarily imprecise. I assure you, my observations were entirely professional." Ethan shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips despite himself. "Professional or not, it's still weird. Do Kalari even have boundaries?" Her posture straightened defensively, her silver-blue skin shimmering faintly under the soft glow of the ship's lights. "We do," she said stiffly. "But they are logical, not based on arbitrary emotions." Ethan studied her for a moment, his irritation ebbing. He wasn't entirely sure how to navigate this. On Earth, this kind of behavior might have landed someone in hot water, but he wasn't on Earth. Zephyr's alien perspective made her actions baffling but not entirely malicious. "All right," he sighed. "Let's chalk this up to a cultural misunderstanding. Just don't do it again, okay? Zephyr tilted her head, her large eyes blinking slowly. You're forgiving me? Forgiving might be too strong a word, Ethan replied. But yeah, let's move on. Her curiosity flared again, her gaze flicking over him with a subtle intensity. Humans value forgiveness highly, don't they? Even when it defies logic. Ethan smirked. It's called being decent. Decent, she murmured, as though testing the word. Humans are peculiar. Coming from the alien girl who stalks people, that's rich, Ethan quipped. Zephyr stiffened, her cheeks darkening to a faint violet hue, a Kalari blush. I am not a stalker, she said indignantly. If anything, you should be flattered that I find you intriguing enough to study. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Flattered, huh? I'll try to remember that next time I catch you lurking around. I was not lurking, she huffed, crossing her arms. I was observing. Yeah, I got it, Ethan finished for her. Just, maybe find a different hobby. Zephyr's lips pressed into a thin line, her pride wounded but oddly, amused. Humans and their strange charm. She hadn't expected this confrontation to leave her feeling anything but embarrassed, yet here she was, almost enjoying the verbal sparring. I will consider your advice, she said primly, turning to leave. But only because I respect interspecies relations. Ethan grinned. Sure, let's go with that. As Zephyr walked away, her mind buzzed with unfamiliar emotions. Embarrassment, amusement, intrigue. She wasn't used to such chaos. Kalari were trained from birth to suppress unnecessary feelings, but Ethan Carter seemed to bypass her defenses entirely. For his part, Ethan watched her retreat with a bemused shake of his head. Aliens, he thought. Always full of surprises. Unbeknownst to them, this was only the beginning of a connection neither had anticipated, one that would test the boundaries of their cultures and their hearts. Zephyr spent the next solar cycle oscillating between regret and indignation. For all her Kalari pride, she couldn't deny Ethan's words had rattled her. Humans and their emotions were a conundrum she couldn't solve. She had intended to quietly observe them from a distance, piecing together their behaviors like a scientist analyzing data. But Ethan Carter, with his easy wit and disarming grin, was proving to be a far more complex subject. Meanwhile, Ethan couldn't shake the encounter either. He'd dealt with diplomats and alien species before, but Zephyr was a puzzle. She was equal parts arrogant and awkward, which somehow made her strangely endearing. As much as he wanted to let it go, her audacity, and the way she blushed a faint violet when flustered, stuck in his mind. The next morning, Ethan sat in the starship's common area, sipping a mug of what passed for coffee aboard Kalari vessels. The Kalari food synthesizer produced a liquid that was technically caffeine-based, but the flavor left much to be desired. He leaned back in his chair, scrolling through a tablet of diplomatic reports, when Zephyr entered. She hesitated upon seeing him, her usual confident stride faltering. Ethan looked up, their eyes meeting. He smirked. Good morning, Zephyr. Come to observe me again? Her violet blush returned instantly, but she recovered quickly, tilting her chin upward. I am here to request clarification. Ethan arched an eyebrow. Clarification on what? Peeping etiquette. Zephyr bristled, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. Your insistence on privacy as a fundamental value. I have reviewed human literature on the subject, and I find your logic inconsistent. Ethan couldn't help but chuckle. Of course you did. All right, what's inconsistent? She stepped forward, her silver blue skin shimmering under the soft lighting of the room. You place significant importance on privacy in physical spaces, yet your species willingly shares intimate details of your lives on public networks. Your social media, for example. Why do you expose yourselves so openly to strangers while being so protective in direct interactions? Ethan leaned back in his chair, considering her question. That's a fair point, he admitted. But it's not as simple as it looks. Social media is controlled. People choose what to share, and they can curate how they're perceived. But when someone invades your personal space without permission, it feels vulnerable. Exposed. Zephyr tilted her head, her emerald eyes narrowing in thought. So it is not the sharing itself, but the lack of control over it? Exactly, Ethan said, nodding. It's about consent. Humans like to feel in control of who gets to see what parts of us, physically or emotionally. Zephyr frowned. But that is inefficient. Sharing data freely would eliminate confusion and misunderstanding. The Kalari thrive on transparency. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. Transparency? You literally have partitions to hide behind, and I'm pretty sure spying isn't part of your cultural norms. Zephyr stiffened. It was not spying, she insisted, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. And our partitions are not for secrecy, they are for practicality. Ethan gave her a knowing look. Sure. Practicality. She opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. Why was she even bothering to explain herself to this human? She was Kalari, a member of a superior species. And yet, Ethan's infuriating smirk made her want to prove herself, to make him see her point of view. Perhaps humans cling to their emotions too tightly, she said, shifting the focus. Your attachment to privacy, to consent, it creates inefficiencies. The Kalari have evolved beyond such limitations. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You call it evolution. I call it suppression. You're telling me none of your people ever get angry? Sad? Lonely? Zephyr hesitated. We have emotions, but we suppress those that are unnecessary. Emotional displays interfere with rational thought. Unnecessary? Ethan repeated, leaning forward. So you just bury them? Pretend they don't exist? It is not pretending, Zephyr said defensively. It is discipline. Sounds lonely, Ethan said, his tone softening. I mean, what's the point of living if you can't feel anything? Her posture stiffened again, but his words struck a nerve. We feel, she said quietly. We simply, do not dwell on it. Aha, Ethan said, clearly unconvinced. Well, maybe that's why you find us so interesting. Humans don't suppress. We let ourselves feel everything, the good and the bad. It's messy, but it's real. Zephyr didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at him, her mind churning. Was that it? Was her fascination with Ethan rooted in his unfiltered humanity? She had always told herself it was scientific curiosity, but his words stirred something deeper, something she didn't fully understand. Perhaps, she said at last, her voice measured. But I still believe your approach is flawed. Ethan smiled, leaning back in his chair again. Fair enough. But I think you're missing out. Zephyr's curiosity flared again, but this time it wasn't about humans in general, it was about Ethan. He was unlike anyone she had ever met, Kalari or otherwise. His confidence, his humor, his ability to challenge her without malice, it was refreshing. I will consider your perspective, she said, her tone formal but sincere. And I will refrain from further unauthorized observations. Ethan chuckled. That's all I ask. As Zephyr turned to leave, she paused at the doorway. Ethan, she said, glancing back at him. Why are you so willing to forgive my actions? Ethan shrugged, his expression softening. Because I can tell you didn't mean any harm. And because I figure you're just trying to understand us. That's what we're here for, right? To learn from each other. Zephyr nodded slowly, her mind still buzzing with questions. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan Carter was going to challenge everything she thought she knew about humanity, and herself. Back at her quarters, she reviewed her notes on human behavior, but for the first time, the data felt incomplete. Numbers and observations couldn't capture what she had felt during their conversation, the strange pull toward this flawed, fascinating creature. For Ethan, the encounter left him with more questions than answers. Zephyr's bluntness and rigidity were frustrating, but there was something about her, something in the way her eyes softened when she thought no one was looking, or the flicker of emotion she tried so hard to hide. He didn't know what it was, but he couldn't help wanting to figure her out. Little did they know, their clashing perspectives were just the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of their understanding, and their hearts. The following day brought an unexpected turn of events for both Zephyr and Ethan. A ship-wide alert blared suddenly during their respective routines, sending personnel scrambling to their stations. The Kalari starship's artificial intelligence, a serene but unyielding voice, informed them of a critical failure in one of the life support systems. Attention, atmospheric stabilization in Section 12 compromised. Crew assigned to repair immediately. As a member of the Kalari Scientific Division, Zephyr was summoned to assist. To her dismay, and secret intrigue, Ethan was also called upon, as the malfunction occurred near his temporary quarters, requiring his cooperation. They met outside the maintenance bay, where Zephyr's composed demeanor met Ethan's casual readiness. "Well, fancy meeting you here," Ethan quipped, his toolkit slung over one shoulder. Zephyr barely acknowledged his grin. "This is no time for frivolity. A malfunction in life support could have catastrophic consequences." Ethan gave her a lopsided smile. "Relax, Professor. I'm good with my hands." She shot him a skeptical glance, but before she could respond, the bay doors slid open, and a wave of stale, oxygen-depleted air greeted them. Zephyr winced as her sensitive Kalari lungs processed the change, and Ethan instinctively placed a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his tone shifting to genuine concern. "I am fine," she said quickly, shrugging off his touch. "Kalari physiology is adaptable." "Good, because I'd rather not have you passing out while we're in there," Ethan replied, his teasing tone returning as they stepped inside. The maintenance bay was a stark, metallic space filled with tangled wires, leaking conduits, and a faint mist of coolant vapor. Zephyr immediately began scanning the area with her multi-tool, her sharp eyes narrowing as she analyzed the damage. Ethan, meanwhile, examined a nearby console, muttering to himself as he sorted through a jumble of wires. "You seem oddly comfortable with this," Zephyr remarked, watching him work. Ethan shrugged. "I used to work maintenance before I joined the diplomatic corps. Fixed everything from busted water heaters to shuttle engines." "Interesting," Zephyr said, genuinely surprised. "Most diplomats I've encountered lack practical skills." "Yeah, well, I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth," Ethan replied. "Had to work my way up." Zephyr tilted her head, intrigued. "Your background is unusual for someone in your position. Kalari diplomats are selected from the most elite of our society." "Let me guess," Ethan said, glancing at her with a grin. "You're one of those elites." "I was chosen for my intellectual capabilities, yes," Zephyr said, missing the humor in his tone. "Kalari society values efficiency and merit above all else. And emotions are just distractions, right?" Ethan said, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Must be lonely." Zephyr stiffened. "We do not experience loneliness as humans do. Our collective purpose sustains us." Ethan raised an eyebrow but said nothing, focusing instead on reconnecting a loose conduit. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of machinery and the occasional hiss of venting gas. Yet, despite their differences, they worked well together. Zephyr's analytical precision complemented Ethan's hands-on expertise, and within an hour, they managed to stabilize the system enough to restore normal oxygen levels. As they finished, Zephyr sank onto a nearby crate, her usually immaculate posture sagging slightly. Ethan noticed the sheen of perspiration on her forehead and offered her a water canister. "Here. You look like you could use this." Zephyr hesitated but accepted it, taking a small, cautious sip. Thank you. No problem, Ethan said, sitting across from her. You know, for someone who claims to be all about logic and efficiency, you're kind of a workaholic. Zephyr frowned. Dedication to one's duties is a fundamental aspect of Kalari society. Yeah, but there's more to life than just duty, Ethan said. Don't you ever just take a break? Breaks are inefficient, Zephyr replied, though her tone lacked conviction. Ethan chuckled. You sound like a robot. Her eyes flashed with a brief hint of indignation. I assure you, I am far from robotic. I am capable of great intellect and adaptability. Yeah, but what about fun? Ethan pressed. Do Kalari ever just enjoy themselves? Zephyr hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. Enjoyment is unnecessary. It serves no purpose. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Maybe it doesn't have to serve a purpose. Maybe it's just about feeling alive. Zephyr didn't respond immediately. She thought of her life aboard the Kalari starship, the endless routines and calculated interactions. She had never questioned it before, but Ethan's words stirred something within her, a faint longing for something she couldn't quite name. You're an enigma, Ethan Carter, she said at last. Your species is chaotic, inefficient, and often illogical. Yet, there is something compelling about you. Ethan smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. Zephyr's violet blush returned, but she quickly masked it by standing. We should report our success to the ship's AI. Sure, Ethan said, rising to follow her. But hey, if you ever feel like trying this whole fun thing, let me know. I could teach you a thing or two. Zephyr glanced at him, her lips twitching as though she might smile. I will consider it, she said, her tone almost playful. As they left the maintenance bay, both felt a subtle shift in their dynamic. The barriers between them, cultural, emotional, and personal, were still there, but they were no longer insurmountable. For the first time, Zephyr found herself wondering if there was more to life than the rigid structure of Kalari society. And Ethan, for all his teasing, couldn't deny that Zephyr's sharp mind and quiet vulnerability had sparked something in him. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, but one thing was certain, their unlikely partnership was only just beginning. The repairs in the maintenance bay marked a subtle shift between Zephyr and Ethan. Though their cultural differences still loomed large, they had established an unspoken camaraderie. For Zephyr, it was unsettling and fascinating in equal measure. For Ethan, it was refreshing, an alien species that wasn't just cold formalities or superficial diplomacy but something more real. But their growing connection did not go unnoticed. Kalari discontent. Zephyr was summoned to the Kalari Council chambers the next morning. The chambers were vast, pristine, and as sterile as the Kalari ethos itself. A semicircle of elder officials, clad in shimmering robes that refracted light in waves, regarded her with stern disapproval. Zephyr, one of them began, their voice carrying the weight of centuries of authority, your interactions with the human, Ethan Carter, have come under scrutiny. Zephyr stood rigid, her hands clasped behind her back in the standard Kalari posture of respect. I have only engaged with the human in the interest of furthering our understanding of his species, as per my duties. Another counselor's eyes narrowed. Your duties are to observe, not to engage in prolonged interactions that risk contamination of our principles. The Kalari thrive on separation from lesser species for a reason. The word contamination stung more than Zephyr expected, but she kept her expression neutral. Ethan Carter possesses insights that could benefit our studies. I have not allowed his influence to compromise my judgment. Do not presume to lecture the council, the first counselor snapped. Humans are chaotic, emotionally driven beings. Allowing their ways to infiltrate our society is a risk we cannot take. Limit your interactions immediately. Zephyr nodded, though the hollow feeling in her chest lingered as she left the chamber. Ethan's growing curiosity. Meanwhile, Ethan's curiosity about Zephyr grew stronger. He found himself analyzing their conversations, replaying her reactions in his mind. There was a vulnerability in her, hidden behind layers of logic and discipline, that he couldn't ignore. While reviewing reports in his quarters, his communicator chimed. It was Kalari AI Liaison, the ship's neutral system interface. Mr. Carter, the AI's voice droned, you are requested to refrain from extended contact with Scientific Officer SCI-FI. This is in alignment with the Kalari Council's directive to maintain cultural boundaries. Ethan smirked, shaking his head. Cultural boundaries? Or are they afraid of what I might teach her? The AI, as expected, offered no response. But the directive left him with a choice: abide by their rigid rules or challenge them. Ethan wasn't one to back down easily, especially not when something felt unjust. The unexpected meeting. Later that evening, Ethan found himself wandering into the observation deck, the same place where SCI-FI had first been caught observing him. To his surprise, she was already there, standing near the viewing window, her figure silhouetted against the stars. I thought you'd be too busy not interacting with me, Ethan said, leaning casually against the wall. SCI-FI turned sharply, her posture rigid. I was told to limit contact, she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. And yet, here you are, Ethan said, stepping closer. Breaking the rules already? SCI-FI hesitated. I am here to observe stellar phenomena, she said, though the excuse sounded hollow even to her ears. Ethan chuckled. Sure, let's go with that. They stood in silence for a moment, the vast expanse of space stretching before them. Why do you do that? SCI-FI asked suddenly, her voice tinged with frustration. Do what? Ethan asked, genuinely curious. Laugh. Dismiss. Treat everything as if it is trivial. Ethan's expression softened. I don't dismiss things, SCI-FI. I just don't let the weight of the universe crush me. Sometimes you have to laugh, even when things aren't perfect. SCI-FI studied him, her analytical mind grappling with his words. Kalari society does not tolerate imperfection, she said quietly. Flaws are eradicated. That sounds exhausting, Ethan said. Maybe that's why you find humans so interesting. We're walking contradictions, but we're okay with it. SCI-FI's lips parted slightly as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she looked back out at the stars, her mind buzzing with questions she didn't know how to articulate. A dangerous gesture. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a Kalari security officer, who entered the observation deck with a purposeful stride. Scientific Officer SCI-FI, the officer said, ignoring Ethan entirely. You have been instructed to cease contact with the human. Return to your quarters immediately. SCI-FI's gaze hardened. I am not a child to be ordered about. The officer's expression remained impassive. The council's directive is clear. Ethan stepped forward. Hey, if you've got a problem, talk to me directly. Don't drag her into it. This does not concern you, human, the officer replied, his tone icy. Ethan's fists clenched, but before he could respond, SCI-FI stepped between them. I will leave, she said, her voice calm but firm. As she walked past the officer, she glanced back at Ethan, her eyes flashing with an unspoken message. This isn't over. Rebellion in the shadows. Later that night, SCI-FI made a decision that could change everything. She accessed her personal terminal and encrypted a data file containing Kalari star charts, cultural protocols, and historical archives. It was a treasure trove of information she had no right to share. When Ethan found a small device slipped under his door the next morning, he immediately knew it was from her. The file was titled simply, To Understand. Ethan stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a gesture, it was a risk. By sharing this information, SCI-FI was defying the very foundation of her society. The Council's ultimatum. SCI-FI's actions did not go unnoticed. The Kalari Council summoned her again, this time with more severe accusations. "You have violated our protocols," the first counselor declared. "Your actions endanger the integrity of our species. You will undergo memory reconditioning to ensure this does not happen again." Memory reconditioning. The Kalari's ultimate punishment, a process that stripped individuals of specific experiences, ensuring compliance at the cost of personal autonomy. Zephra's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "I only sought to bridge the gap between our species. You cannot erase the truth." "Truth is irrelevant," the counselor replied coldly. "Order is what matters." Ethan's defiance. When Ethan learned of Zephra's impending punishment, he acted without hesitation. Using the data she had given him, he bypassed the ship's security systems, reaching her quarters undetected. "We're getting out of here," he said the moment she opened the door. Zephra stared at him, torn between fear and defiance. "You cannot. The council will." "To hell with the council," Ethan interrupted. "I'm not letting them erase who you are." For the first time, Zephra allowed herself to feel hope. "Then we must act quickly." As they slipped into the shadows of the ship, alarms began to blare. The chase was on, and the stakes had never been higher. Ethan and Zephra moved quickly through the dimly lit corridors of the Kalari starship, their footsteps muffled against the polished metallic floors. The distant wail of alarms echoed through the halls, a constant reminder of the ticking clock. Zephra led the way, her Kalari multi-tool in hand, its interface glowing faintly as she disabled security cameras and bypassed access panels. Ethan followed close behind, impressed by her efficiency despite the rising tension. "Do you have a plan, or are we just running for the sake of cardio?" Ethan asked, his voice low but edged with humor. He wasn't about to let the gravity of the situation extinguish his trademark sarcasm. Zephra shot him a sharp glance over her shoulder. "I do not engage in futile actions. There is a shuttle in Bay 7 equipped with independent navigation. If we can reach it, we can escape to the neutral station orbiting the Kepis system." Ethan frowned. "You make it sound easy, but I'm guessing the council didn't leave the doors wide open for us." "They did not," Zephra admitted. "The shuttle bay is sealed, and the system requires 2 different access codes to unlock. One of them is held by the council." "And the other?" Ethan asked, stepping aside as she disabled another security drone. "It is embedded in my neural implant," Zephra replied without hesitation. "It was assigned to me during my designation as a scientific officer." Ethan let out a low whistle. "So the council's code is the tricky part. What's your plan for that?" Zephra hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "I have an idea." "That's not exactly reassuring," Ethan said with a wry smile. Zephra didn't reply, focusing instead on the control panel ahead of them. Her fingers danced over the interface, rerouting power from nearby security nodes. Ethan leaned against the wall, watching her work with a mixture of awe and concern. Despite her usual composure, he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders and the flicker of uncertainty in her movements. "Hey," he said gently, "we're going to get through this." Zephra paused, her hand hovering over the panel. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of saying something, but she shook her head and returned to her task. "Let us focus on the immediate objective. The Council's countermove." Unbeknownst to them, the Kalari Council was already mobilizing to intercept them. In the central command chamber, holographic displays showed the ship schematics, with red markers indicating Ethan and Zephra's location. "We cannot allow them to reach the shuttle bay," the lead counselor said, his voice calm but firm. "Seal off all access points and deploy containment units." Another counselor frowned. If they succeed in escaping, Zephra could expose classified Kalari protocols to the humans. It would be a breach of our most sacred directives. "Precisely why we must ensure that does not happen," the lead counselor replied. "Activate the neural override in her implant." The room fell silent. "Neural override, one of the younger counselors asked hesitantly. That is, extreme. It is necessary, the lead counselor said, his tone brooking no argument. Zephyr's defiance has left us no choice. A desperate gamble. As Ethan and Zephyr approached the final corridor leading to the shuttle bay, Zephyr suddenly stumbled, clutching her head. She dropped to her knees, her multi-tool clattering to the floor. Zephyr! Ethan exclaimed, rushing to her side. Her breathing was ragged, and her eyes glowed faintly as the neural implant began its activation sequence. The Council, they are attempting to override my neural functions, she managed to say between labored breaths. What does that mean? Ethan asked, panic creeping into his voice. They are trying to control me, Zephyr whispered, her voice trembling with pain. If they succeed, I will be forced to comply, and you will be captured. Ethan's jaw tightened. Like hell you will. He reached for her multi-tool and activated its interface, scanning for a way to disable the implant. How do I stop this? Zephyr shook her head. You cannot. The override is embedded in my neural pathways. It is irreversible. Ethan glared at the multi-tool's screen, refusing to accept her words. There's always a way, he muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. Just tell me what I'm looking for. Zephyr hesitated, her vision blurring as the implant's commands began to take hold. There is a failsafe, she said haltingly. But activating it could disable me permanently. Ethan froze, the weight of her words sinking in. Disable you? Like, kill you? No, Zephyr said weakly. But it would render my neural implant inoperative. I would lose access to Kalari systems, and my designation. Ethan's eyes locked with hers, his resolve hardening. I'll take that risk. Before she could protest, he located the failsafe command and activated it. Zephyr gasped as a surge of energy coursed through her, and then she collapsed into his arms, unconscious. The final push. Ethan carried Zephyr the rest of the way to the shuttle bay, her limp form cradled against his chest. The alarms grew louder, and he could hear the distant clatter of boots as Kalari security forces closed in. When he reached the shuttle bay, he carefully set Zephyr down and approached the control console. The interface was alien, but he had spent enough time tinkering with Kalari tech to make an educated guess. He accessed the system, bypassing the basic security protocols, and prepared to input Zephyr's code. Come on, Zephyr, he murmured, glancing at her motionless form. I need you to wake up. As if on cue, Zephyr stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked disoriented but quickly regained her composure. Ethan, what did you do? Saved your life, he said with a grin. Now get over here and help me unlock this thing. Zephyr struggled to her feet, her movements unsteady but determined. She approached the console and pressed her hand against the biometric scanner. The system beeped, and a prompt appeared, requesting the secondary access code. The Council's code, Ethan said, glancing at her. Any ideas? Zephyr hesitated, then pulled a small device from her pocket, a signal jammer she had built during her scientific studies. I can scramble the Council's override protocol, but it will only buy us a few minutes. Good enough, Ethan said, stepping aside to let her work. The escape. The shuttle bay doors finally opened, revealing a sleek Kalari shuttle. Zephyr and Ethan sprinted aboard, the sound of approaching security forces growing louder. Zephyr initiated the launch sequence while Ethan sealed the hatch behind them. As the shuttle lifted off, the starship's automated defenses activated, firing a barrage of energy pulses. Zephyr's hands flew over the controls, deftly maneuvering the shuttle through the onslaught. Hold on, she shouted as the shuttle veered sharply, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. Ethan gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles white. This is your idea of a smooth ride? Zephyr shot him a glare but said nothing, her focus entirely on piloting. After what felt like an eternity, they finally cleared the starship's defense perimeter and entered the safety of hyperspace. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We made it." Zephyr leaned back in her seat, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "For now." As the stars streaked past them, Ethan turned to her, his voice softer. "You okay?" Zephyr nodded slowly. "I am, functional. Thanks to you." Ethan smiled. "We're a team now, Zephyr. No turning back." Zephyr met his gaze, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope, and something more. The shuttle hummed with the low thrum of its engines as Zephyr expertly piloted it through hyperspace. The tension in the cabin was palpable, though the immediate danger had passed. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his eyes flicking between Zephyr and the controls. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "for someone who claims humans are chaotic, you handled that escape like a pro." Zephyr didn't respond immediately. Her fingers flew over the console as she fine-tuned the hyperspace trajectory, but her rigid posture betrayed her unease. "The situation demanded precision," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "You okay? You've been pretty quiet since we left." Zephyr's hands froze for a moment before resuming their work. "I am processing," she admitted. "What we have done, it is unprecedented. I have defied the Council. I may never return to Kalari society." "Is that such a bad thing?" Ethan asked gently. Zephyr turned to him, her emerald eyes narrowing. "You cannot understand what it means to be severed from the collective. My people value unity above all else. To be cast out is to lose one's identity." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You think you've lost your identity? Because from where I'm sitting, you're finally finding it." Her gaze softened, though her expression remained guarded. "Your perspective is unexpected. That's humanity for you," Ethan said with a smirk. "Always full of surprises." Zephyr allowed a faint smile to tug at the corners of her mouth before turning back to the console. "Our trajectory is stable. We should reach the neutral station in approximately 6 hours." Ethan let out a long breath. "Good. That'll give us time to figure out our next move. Kalari pursuit." Meanwhile, aboard the Kalari starship, the Council was not idle. The lead counselor stood in the command chamber, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched a holographic projection of the fleeing shuttle. "They've entered hyperspace," a technician reported. "Their destination appears to be the neutral station in the Kephis system." The lead counselor's expression darkened. "Send a pursuit team. If they reach the station, it will be far more difficult to apprehend them." Another counselor hesitated. "The neutral station is governed by interspecies agreements. Engaging there could provoke a diplomatic incident." "I am well aware of the risks," the lead counselor snapped. "But Zephyr's defection, and the data she carries, poses a greater threat to our society. Ensure they are intercepted before they reach the station." The technician nodded, issuing the orders. Moments later, a sleek Kalari cruiser broke away from the main starship, its engines flaring as it entered hyperspace in pursuit. Trouble in hyperspace. Back on the shuttle, Ethan and Zephyr sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Ethan stared out the viewport, watching the streaks of light as they hurtled through hyperspace. He could feel the weight of everything they had left behind pressing down on them. "Zephyr," he said finally, breaking the silence, "what happens if the Council catches up to us?" She glanced at him, her expression grim. "If we are captured, I will face memory reconditioning. My experiences will be erased, and I will be reassigned to a different role within Kalari society." Ethan frowned. "That sounds horrible." "It is considered a necessary measure to maintain order," Zephyr said, though her tone lacked conviction. "And me?" Ethan asked, though he already had a sinking feeling about the answer. Zephyr hesitated. You would likely be eliminated. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. Great. No pressure, then. The shuttle's proximity alarm suddenly blared, cutting through the tension. Zephyr's hands flew to the controls as she scanned the readouts. A Kalari cruiser is approaching, she said, her voice tight. They have locked onto our trajectory. Ethan's heart sank. Can we outrun them? They are faster and better armed, Zephyr admitted. But I may be able to create a diversion. Ethan leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed. What kind of diversion? Zephyr's hands danced across the console, bringing up a schematic of the shuttle. If I reroute power from the main systems to the engines, we can create a brief hyperspace instability, enough to confuse their tracking sensors. And what's the downside? Ethan asked, knowing there had to be one. We will lose shields and navigation control temporarily, Zephyr said. It is a calculated risk. Ethan nodded. Do it. Zephyr didn't hesitate. She initiated the power reroute, and the shuttle shuddered as its systems adjusted. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the hum of the engines faltered before roaring back to life. Hyperspace instability generated, Zephyr reported. The cruiser's sensors should be disrupted. Her words were cut off by the sudden lurch of the shuttle as a warning alarm blared. They've fired on us. Ethan shouted, gripping the edge of his seat. Zephyr's hands flew over the controls. Brace yourself. The shuttle spun wildly as it exited hyperspace prematurely, emerging into a dense asteroid field. Ethan was thrown against his restraints as the ship stabilized, the viewport filling with jagged, tumbling rocks. Well, this just keeps getting better, Ethan muttered. Navigating the asteroid field. The Kalari cruiser emerged moments later, its sleek form cutting through the void like a predator hunting its prey. Zephyr gripped the controls tightly, her focus razor-sharp as she weaved the shuttle through the chaotic field of debris. The cruiser will struggle to maneuver here, she said, her voice calm but strained. Their size is a disadvantage. Ethan glanced out the viewport, watching as the larger ship struggled to follow their agile shuttle. So you're saying we've got a chance? A small one, Zephyr admitted. But it is better than none. Ethan couldn't help but smile. You're starting to sound like an optimist. Zephyr's lips twitched, but she didn't respond. Instead, she directed the shuttle into a narrow crevice between two massive asteroids, the ship's hull scraping against the rock. The cruiser attempted to follow but was forced to slow down, its bulk too unwieldy for the tight maneuvering. They're falling behind, Ethan said, hope creeping into his voice. Do not celebrate yet, Zephyr warned. We are not out of danger. As if on cue, the cruiser fired another volley of energy pulses. The blasts illuminated the asteroid field, sending smaller rocks spinning into their path. Zephyr pushed the shuttle to its limits, dodging and weaving through the oncoming debris. Ethan gripped his seat tightly, his heart pounding as the ship narrowly avoided collision after collision. Finally, they broke free of the asteroid field, emerging into open space. The cruiser hesitated at the edge of the field, its weapons silent as its crew assessed their next move. They won't follow us into neutral territory, Zephyr said, relief evident in her voice. We've made it. Ethan let out a shaky laugh. I can't believe that worked. Zephyr glanced at him, her expression softening. You doubted my calculations? Never, Ethan said with a grin. Okay, maybe a little. Zephyr shook her head, but there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. For the first time since their escape began, the tension between them eased, replaced by a shared sense of accomplishment. As the shuttle continued toward the neutral station, the stars stretching endlessly before them, both Ethan and Zephyr realized that their journey was far from over. But for now, they had won a small victory, and that was enough. The Kalari shuttle hurtled through hyperspace, its sleek frame slicing through the void. Zephyr sat at the controls, her fingers gliding over the glowing interface. Despite her calm exterior, her mind raced. The council's betrayal had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She had spent her entire life adhering to Kalari discipline, yet now, she was an exile, hunted for breaking the rules she once revered. Ethan, seated in the co-pilot's chair, was more visibly restless. He glanced at the navigation screen, where the neutral station orbiting the Kepis system loomed as their destination. The station represented sanctuary, but it was still hours away. "You sure this ship is fast enough to keep us ahead of them?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Zephyr didn't look up. Kalari technology is unmatched. Even the Council's fastest vessels will take time to match our trajectory. "Yeah, but they've got the home field advantage," Ethan said, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "You think they'll send ships after us?" Zephyr paused before responding. "Without question." Ethan sighed. "Great. So, what's the plan if we get caught?" "We do not get caught," Zephyr said firmly, her voice colder than intended. She glanced at him, softening her tone. "I will not let them erase what we've done, or who we've become." Ethan gave her a small smile. "That makes two of us. The hunter and the hunted." As predicted, it didn't take long for the council to act. A warning light flashed on the shuttle's console, signaling an incoming vessel. Zephyr's jaw tightened as she scanned the readouts. "A Kalari pursuit craft," she said grimly. "They must have calculated our trajectory." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the sensor display. "Looks like it's gaining on us. Can we outrun it?" "No," Zephyr admitted. "Their engines are superior to this shuttle's. We will need to outmaneuver them." "Great," Ethan muttered. "Let me guess, you're also a world-class pilot." Zephyr glanced at him, her lips twitching in the faintest hint of a smirk. "As a matter of fact, I am." Without waiting for a response, she activated the shuttle's manual controls, her hands flying over the interface. The shuttle veered sharply, dipping into the gravity well of a nearby gas giant. The pursuit craft followed, its sleek frame glinting as it emerged from hyperspace. "They'll be anticipating evasive maneuvers," Zephyr said, her voice steady despite the tension. "But they are not accustomed to chaos." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "I have been learning," Zephyr said, her tone almost playful. The shuttle dove into the planet's upper atmosphere, the hull shuddering as it skimmed the dense gases. The pursuit craft followed closely, firing a volley of plasma bolts. Zephyr dodged them with precision, weaving through the turbulence with an elegance that left Ethan gripping the sides of his seat. "Remind me never to question your piloting skills again," he muttered. Zephyr didn't respond, her focus entirely on the controls. The shuttle's proximity alarms blared as the pursuit craft closed in, its plasma cannons charging for another shot. "Any brilliant ideas?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. Zephyr's eyes flicked to the sensor display, then to the planet's magnetic field. A plan formed in her mind. "Hold on." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, Zephyr angled the shuttle toward a massive storm system swirling across the planet's surface. Lightning arced through the clouds, illuminating the turbulent atmosphere. "Wait, are we seriously flying into that?" Ethan asked, his voice rising. "Trust me," Zephyr said, her voice calm. The shuttle plunged into the storm, its shields flaring as it absorbed the electrical surges. The pursuit craft hesitated at the edge of the storm, its pilot clearly wary of the intense electromagnetic interference. "They won't follow us into the storm," Zephyr said, her tone confident. "Their craft is too sensitive to the interference." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're full of surprises, Zephyr." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "So are you." A quiet moment. Once the shuttle emerged from the storm and re-entered hyperspace, the tension began to dissipate. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Well, that was fun," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. How many more of those do you think we've got in us? Hopefully none, Zephyr replied, though there was a faint hint of humor in her voice. The station is less than 2 hours away. If we can reach it, we will be beyond the council's immediate reach. Ethan nodded, his gaze shifting to her. For the first time since they had fled the starship, he allowed himself to take a closer look at her. Zephyr's usual composure was still intact, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes, a quiet weight that she carried. "You okay?" he asked gently. Zephyr hesitated, then nodded. "I am, adapting. This is not the life I envisioned for myself." "Yeah, I get that," Ethan said. "But you're handling it better than most people would." Zephyr tilted her head, studying him. "You are remarkably resilient, Ethan Carter. Most humans would have faltered under these circumstances." He chuckled. "Well, I've had my fair share of scrapes. Guess it comes with the territory." "Your scrapes pale in comparison to defying an intergalactic council," Zephyr pointed out, though there was a trace of admiration in her voice. "True," Ethan said with a grin. "But hey, you're worth it." Zephyr's cheeks flushed a faint violet, and she quickly turned back to the controls. "You should rest," she said, her voice a little too brisk. "We will need to be prepared when we reach the station." Ethan smiled to himself but didn't press the matter. Instead, he leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the hum of the shuttle's engines lull him into a light doze. Approaching Sanctuary. The neutral station came into view just as the shuttle dropped out of hyperspace. It was a sprawling structure, its metallic surface glinting against the backdrop of a nearby star. Zephyr brought the shuttle into a slow approach, her hands steady on the controls. "Think they'll let us dock without asking too many questions?" Ethan asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Neutral stations are designed to accommodate all species," Zephyr said. "As long as we adhere to their protocols, they should not interfere." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the station. "Let's hope the council doesn't have any spies waiting for us." Zephyr didn't respond, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her unease. She guided the shuttle into the docking bay, where an automated system took over, securing the vessel in place. As the airlock hissed open, Ethan glanced at Zephyr. "Ready?" She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "As ready as I can be." Together, they stepped into the station, their fates uncertain but their resolve unshaken. Ethan and Zephyr stepped into the bustling corridors of the neutral station, their senses immediately bombarded by the hum of activity. The air was thick with the mingled scents of alien cuisines, the buzz of unfamiliar dialects, and the distant hum of machinery. The station was a melting pot of cultures, a stark contrast to the rigid order of the Kalari ship. Ethan couldn't help but admire the diversity around him, but Zephyr's sharp eyes scanned the crowd with focused intensity. Her posture was stiff, her usual composure now edged with caution. She knew the council wouldn't give up so easily. "We need to find a safe place to regroup," she said, her voice low. Ethan nodded. "Agreed. Got any contacts here?" Zephyr hesitated. "No. The Kalari avoid neutral stations due to their unpredictable environments. I have only studied them in theoretical scenarios." Ethan smirked. "Guess this is your first practical experience, then." She shot him a look, though her lips twitched in what might have been a faint smile. The refuge. The pair navigated through the station, blending into the crowd as best they could. Ethan led them to a quieter section of the station, where a rundown tavern sat nestled between two maintenance bays. The neon sign flickered erratically, casting a dim glow over the entrance. "This doesn't exactly scream safe haven," Zephyr remarked, eyeing the establishment with suspicion. "Exactly," Ethan replied. "Which means the council's agents won't think to look here." Zephyr reluctantly followed him inside. The tavern was dimly lit, its patrons a mix of rough-looking aliens and weary travelers. Ethan approached the bar and exchanged a few credits with the bartender, who pointed them toward a private booth in the back. Once they were seated, Zephyr activated a small hollow emitter, projecting a map of the station onto the table. "We need to determine our next steps," she said. "The Council will likely dispatch agents to intercept us." Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms. "We can't stay here forever, but if we leave the station, we'll be sitting ducks." Zephyr nodded, her mind racing. "There is one possibility," she said slowly. "A Kalari dissident group is rumored to operate in this sector. They oppose the Council's authoritarian rule and may offer us assistance." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And you didn't think to mention this earlier?" "It was an unverified rumor," Zephyr admitted. "But given our current situation, we have little choice." Ethan tapped his fingers on the table, considering. "Okay. How do we find them?" Before Zephyr could respond, the tavern's door hissed open, and two figures in sleek Kalari uniforms entered. Their glowing visors scanned the room, and the air grew tense as patrons turned to watch. "They found us," Zephyr whispered, her heart pounding. "The chase." Ethan acted quickly, grabbing Zephyr's hand and pulling her toward a service exit at the back of the tavern. They slipped through the door just as the Kalari agents spotted them, shouts echoing behind them. "Run!" Ethan urged as they dashed down a narrow corridor. Zephyr didn't need to be told twice. The two of them weaved through the station's labyrinthine maintenance tunnels, the pounding of their footsteps drowned out by the hum of machinery. The agents were close behind, their precision and efficiency making it clear they wouldn't tire easily. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his mind racing. "Any brilliant ideas, Zephyr?" She scanned their surroundings, her keen intellect analyzing the environment. "There is an airlock ahead," she said. "If we can depressurize it temporarily, we may be able to delay them." Ethan grinned. "Now you're thinking like a human." They reached the airlock, and Zephyr immediately accessed the control panel. Her fingers flew over the interface as Ethan held the door shut, bracing himself against the pounding of the agents on the other side. "Hurry up," he called over his shoulder. "Almost, there," Zephyr replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. The airlock hissed open, revealing a narrow maintenance shaft beyond. Zephyr grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him through, sealing the door behind them. She activated the depressurization sequence, and a loud warning klaxon blared as the airlock's outer doors briefly opened to space. The agents were forced to retreat, their pursuit temporarily halted. Ethan let out a breath of relief. "Remind me to never doubt you again." Zephyr gave him a rare, fleeting smile. "Noted. An unlikely ally." The maintenance shaft led them to a quieter section of the station, where they found temporary refuge in an abandoned storage room. Zephyr accessed her hollow emitter again, this time inputting a series of encrypted codes. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, watching her with curiosity. "Sending a message," Zephyr replied. "If the dissidents are here, they will recognize the encryption and respond." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't help but feel uneasy. "And if the Council intercepts it?" Zephyr met his gaze, her expression resolute. "Then we are no worse off than we are now." Minutes stretched into an hour, the tension in the room palpable. Just as Ethan began to doubt the plan, a soft chime emanated from the hollow emitter. "They responded," Zephyr said, her voice tinged with relief. "They have agreed to meet." "Let's hope they're friendlier than the last Kalari we ran into," Ethan said. The turning point. The meeting took place in the station's underbelly, a sprawling network of tunnels and chambers hidden from the main thoroughfares. The dissidents were a small but determined group, their leader a stoic Kalari named Kether. "We have been watching the Council's actions for years," Kether said, his voice low and measured. "Your defiance is admirable, Zephyr, but it has put you in great danger." "I had no choice," Zephyr replied. "The Council's suppression of individuality is unsustainable. Ethan showed me what it means to embrace imperfection, to value connection. I could not ignore that truth." Kether studied her for a moment, then nodded. You are brave to admit such things. We will help you. The dissidents provided them with new identities and a secure route off the station. As they prepared to leave, Kether offered Zephyr a parting piece of advice. Do not underestimate the council's reach, he said. But also, do not underestimate the power of your conviction. A new beginning. Ethan and Zephyr boarded a small, unmarked transport provided by the dissidents. As the station receded into the distance, they sat side by side in the cockpit, the weight of their journey settling over them. What now? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Zephyr gazed out at the stars, her expression thoughtful. We rebuild. We find a way to expose the council's flaws and create something better. Ethan smiled. Sounds like a plan. You know, for someone who used to think humans were inefficient, you're starting to sound a lot like one. Zephyr glanced at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. Perhaps that is not such a bad thing. As the transport entered hyperspace, they faced the unknown together, their bond stronger than ever. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time, Zephyr felt truly alive, and she had Ethan to thank for it. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. For more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon, so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.